Red Bull were back on top in Japan after a lacklustre performance in Singapore. The top team came back fighting, with Max Verstappen back in a class of his own around Suzuka, winning by almost 20 seconds and taking the fastest lap as well. Meanwhile, it was McLaren that took the most points of all the constructors, with Piastri joining Norris on the podium. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Japanese Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Max Verstappen back on form. The Red Bull team has had perhaps its most dominant World Championship win in 2023, with the team taking the Constructors' Championship crown this weekend in Japan. And all of their points this weekend came from Max Verstappen. The driver continued his tremendous 2023 season with a huge win from pole position, having put one of the best qualifying laps in history in on Saturday, beating his teammate by almost 0.8 of a second. This kind of dominance is what we've grown to expect from Verstappen, and with his performance he silenced those that were suggesting that the team's poor performance in Singapore came as a result of the technical directive changing the way that the FIA tests flexible aero. The Red Bull was a strong car around Suzuka, which is much more of a traditional race circuit compared to the last round, and it has a good mix of low, medium and high-speed turns, with long straights in there as well. For most teams, finding a balance of a car that can perform in several circuit types is not an easy feat, and so it actually made it interesting to see the balance of teams behind Red Bull at this track to get a better idea of the pecking order. Verstappen's win becomes his 13th of the year, as he's looking likely to beat his record of 15 wins in a season that he set last year. When he achieves that, he'll be rounding off one of the most dominant F1 seasons in history, and showing the world what he can do whenever he's confident with his car. The race itself was quite straightforward for Verstappen, as he led from start to finish as he cantered off into the distance. He was briefly challenged by Norris heading into turn 1, but realistically the Dutchman was unfazed as he won with ease. Red Bull's 6th Constructors' Championship has been sealed with 6 rounds to go, which is a sign of the dominance that the team has had this season, as Adrian Newey's car design 2 years into the regulations has been almost unstoppable this season. I don't think it can be anything other than a purple box for Verstappen for an incredibly dominant weekend, and though there may be a few more challenges for the team looking at the circuits to come, it's been an incredibly impressive season in 2023 for Red Bull. McLaren's upgrades continue to show huge promise. McLaren's upgrades were given to Oscar Piastri to match the upgrades shared with Norris in Singapore. In addition, Piastri signed a contract extension with the team, which was announced coming into the weekend, and to celebrate that announcement, Piastri achieved his best F1 weekend yet to continue to show how impressive his rookie season has been. The McLaren seems to have improved in all areas in 2023, and they've been strong at relatively high-speed circuits such as Silverstone, good at slower corner speed circuits like Hungary and Singapore, and now they've found a way to continue their strong performance at Suzuka. The team qualified 2nd and 3rd with Piastri coming out on top, and it certainly seems like the Australian driver is fairly close to Norris in terms of Saturday performance, and getting closer on Sundays as well. The McLaren development this year has been unbelievable. They started the season as one of, if not the worst team, and have grown to become consistent podium challengers with Norris, and took their best result in Japan since the 2021 Italian Grand Prix, when Ricciardo led the team to a 1-2 finish. The 2nd and 3rd position in Japan saw the McLaren firmly as the 2nd fastest team, with them finishing around 20 seconds ahead of Leclerc's Ferrari in the case of Lando Norris. This is a great achievement, and it shows that they've developed their car in such a way that it has now progressed past many of their rivals. The team secured 33 points this weekend, while Aston Martin scored just 4. This 29-point differential has meant that the gap to the Silverstone-based team is close to just 49 points in total. If they progress past Aston Martin by the end of the year, then that result would be staggering. To think that the team that had the best finish of 15th from the first 2 rounds of the year could beat the team that was 2nd to Red Bull at the start of this season would be unthinkable. It shows how the 2nd year of a new aerodynamic regulations are continuing to reward teams that are on good development paths and can accelerate past others on the grid if their development is closer to their ceiling. McLaren's performance in Japan will be memorable, as they look like they have the potential to get to the top of the sport once again in 2024. The team seems to have a way to accelerate new parts to deliver them to their drivers in a staggered fashion, and while this may speed things up, I wonder if it will be a question of which driver will be the best by next season, given how well Piastri is doing this year. On the whole though, it has to be a brilliant green box for McLaren once again for their first double podium of the season and their best performance of 2023 so far. Sergio Perez has his worst weekend in Formula 1. Sergio Perez has had a disappointing couple of races in Asia, with both being full of clumsy incidents where he seemed to have gone for a late lunge down the inside of other drivers. He had incidents with Yuki Tsunoda and Alex Albon in Singapore, and then turned Kevin Magnussen around in Japan. These incidents have been opportunistic and poor. It was really disappointing to see from a driver of the standard and experience level of Perez. Red Bull then also took advantage of a loophole in the rules to send Perez back out following his initial retirement when about 25 laps down to avoid his 5-second penalty being turned into a grid drop in Qatar. This was an interesting choice and a sensible one from the team, albeit perhaps not in the spirits of the rules, although all F1 teams would do it if they had the chance or needed to, but it's still disappointing to see that Perez has still not really felt the punishment from these poor actions. This whole weekend, Verstappen was on top form. He was well out ahead in qualifying, and Perez never really stood a chance when his teammate is at his best. Perez is confirmed for 2024, but he will surely be at risk if these performances and rookie-esque overtakes continue. It has to be said that Perez occasionally has these off weekends and poor runs of form. He's clearly having to adapt his driving style more to suit the needs of this Red Bull than his teammate, and this is costing him points. It'll be interesting to see if he continues on to the rest of the season and into next year, as with the typically ruthless nature of the Red Bull team when it comes to their drivers, they may find that they need to look at alternative options. So for Perez's disappointing weekend in Japan, it's got to be a red box. The Mercedes driver pairing may cause trouble in the future. The Mercedes lineup are both talented drivers at very different stages of their careers. Lewis Hamilton is an experienced 7-time world champion and George Russell is a single race winner. But both drivers seem to be on quite a level playing field at times this year. The Mercedes car has good and bad circuits, and the two drivers have been fairly closely matched in 2023. Given the Mercedes team did well in Spain earlier this year, a circuit where there were both high and low speed corners, I thought the Mercedes could be in for the fight for second fastest in Japan. This wasn't the case, as the team seemed to struggle through the weekend. They were behind the Ferraris, Red Bulls and McLarens in qualifying, and then Hamilton managed to split the Ferraris in the race, given the team tends to be better on Sundays with better tyre management. It was an interesting position for the team to be in, and even George Russell tried to make the one-stop strategy work. A risky move at a high degradation circuit where he would be vulnerable to the faster cars at the end. This is exactly what ended up happening. Russell was being chased down by Hamilton and Sainz as he was instructed by the team to let Hamilton pass, given he was much faster. At this point, Russell tried to suggest an alternative approach where Hamilton would continue to give Russell DRS just as Sainz was doing for Norris in Singapore. However, Suzuka and Singapore are vastly different tracks, and realistically driving slowly to offer DRS would have never worked out for Mercedes given it's easier to overtake at the Japanese circuit. This time spent debating the strategy was time for Sainz to catch up to Hamilton, and this could have cost the team even more points. In the end, they didn't lose out too much on this occasion given they ended up with just 4 points less than Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship, but it could have been worse had Sainz been close enough to Hamilton to make an overtake work. For me, this is another small sign that there could be trouble in the Mercedes driver pairing should they get the opportunity to race at the front for race wins in 2024. It is important to have two drivers in the fight when looking at the Constructors' Championship behind Red Bull, and McLaren are an excellent example of this. It's clear that Mercedes have two drivers willing to fight for every point, but they are at risk of tripping each other up. There's currently just 20 points between Mercedes and Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship, and it could be fascinating to see how they get on going into the final races. So for me, it was a best outcome for Mercedes given the scenario, but I think they need an amber box. Russell's comments and delay tactics when letting Hamilton through was potentially a sign that things could be difficult to manage between the drivers in the future. Ferrari's form could see them fight for second in the Constructors. And on the flip side of that fight, Ferrari are just 20 points behind in the Constructors' Championship to Mercedes, and again this is a sign of just how close the championship could be without Red Bull in it. The Ferrari upgrades have recently put them in a strong position, winning the race in Singapore with Carlos Sainz, and then in Japan they were certainly third fastest behind McLaren. This is good progress compared to many of the other teams, and there are perhaps some signs that the Ferrari team is turning a corner under their new team boss, Fred Vasseur. Ferrari are going to have to work hard to close the 20-point gap to Mercedes. Results like this one where they scored 4 points more than the Silver Arrows would potentially be enough if they could do that consistently between now and the end of the year. Having said this, it looks like there will be some differences in the types of circuits that F1 will visit between now and the end of the season, which may well see the Ferrari struggle at some events. On the whole, I think both Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc are getting what they can from the car at the moment, and they still ended up ahead of Mercedes in Japan despite typically being behind them on race pace, so I think the Italian team deserves a green box for their weekend in Japan. Honourable mentions. Just one honourable mention today, and that's for Alpine. The pair did well to finish 9th and 10th despite an interesting response from Gasly when being asked to hand the position back to Ocon at the end. They are still comfortably the 5th best team, but having said this, they are stuck in no man's land in Formula 1 with their development trajectories seemingly limited. Let me know what I missed from the Japanese Grand Prix in the comments and what could happen next in Qatar.